The grand ossuary of the Galactic Concordance was less a training hall and more a cathedral dedicated to the elegant art of violence. Its vaulted ceilings, carved from the fossilized bone of some long-dead leviathan, soared so high that clouds of nutrient vapor sometimes formed near the apex, drifting like lazy ghosts. The floor was a polished obsidian, inlaid with swirling lines of cryoluminescent circuitry that pulsed with a soft, martial rhythm, a heartbeat for the entire institution. Around the central combat arena, tiered seating rose into the gloom, occupied by a menagerie of beings that looked like a cosmic garage sale of anxiety. There were the Cthar, hulking insectoids in gleaming chitinous armor; the Laminians, beings of pure, shimmering light held loosely in vaguely humanoid containment suits; and the ever-present Vex, whose gelatinous forms quivered with silent, analytical judgment. At the center of it all stood Warlord Korlag Cthar, a creature who was the living embodiment of a supernova trapped in a walking tank. His species, the Crovash, were born for war. He stood a full 3 meters tall, his 4 powerful arms crossed over a chest plate forged from a collapsed neutron star. His voice, when he spoke, was not so much a sound as it was a geological event, a deep, grinding rumble that vibrated in the bones of every being present. He was the head instructor of the ossuary, a master of 1,742 distinct forms of armed and unarmed combat. And he was deeply, profoundly bored. "Observe," he boomed, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. He gestured with one of his upper arms toward the shimmering energy field projected from the device strapped to his lower left forearm. It was a Xylosian Mark IV personal shield, the pinnacle of defensive technology. It glowed with a faint violet light, warping the air around it. This is perfection, an impenetrable barrier of focused gravimetric force. It can repel directed energy bolts, kinetic slugs, even the atmospheric friction of orbital reentry. It is the final word in the conversation of survival. Floating beside him in a small, self-propelled analysis drone was Analyst Ziv, a Vex of considerable repute. Her form, a translucent pyramid of shimmering azure jelly, pulsed with internal light as she processed data. A series of metallic manipulators extended from her drone, taking readings from the shield. Energy output is stable at 99.9 recurring percent. Her synthesized voice chirped, a sound like perfectly tuned glass chimes. The molecular cohesion of the emitter is flawless. To breach this shield with anything less than a starship's primary cannon would be, to use a primitive but effective term, impossible. This was the prevailing galactic wisdom. Technology was strength. Evolution had granted some species claws, some fangs, some armor. But intellect had granted the civilized race's technology, the ultimate evolutionary advantage. It was a clean, efficient, and logical progression. And then there were the humans. The joke. The soft-skinned, slow-breeding, emotionally volatile mammals from the backwater Sol system. They were a recent addition to the Concordance, and their primary contribution thus far had been a series of bewildering diplomatic incidents and a truly baffling beverage they called root beer. The common perception of humanity was that they were fragile. Pathetically so. They had no natural armor, no claws, no venom, no redundant organs. Their bones were brittle, their skin was thin, and they were susceptible to everything from minor atmospheric changes to microscopic organisms their own planet produced in terrifying abundance. They were, by all galactic metrics, a prey species that had somehow stumbled its way into building spaceships through sheer, dumb luck. They were a biological dead end, a footnote in the grand cosmic story. And that was why the arrival of the human cultural liaison, Jake, was met with a wave of poorly concealed amusement. He walked into the grand ossuary as if he were wandering into a local coffee shop. He was of average height and build for his species, wrapped in soft, woven fabrics of blue and gray. His face was unremarkable, his hair was a simple brown, and his expression was one of mild, pleasant interest. He looked, to the assembled warriors and strategists, about as threatening as a damp towel. He carried a long, cloth-wrapped object over his shoulder, which only added to the absurdity of his presence. Korlag Kthar's multifaceted eyes narrowed, all 12 of them focusing on the unassuming mammal. "Human," he rumbled, the word itself an insult. "You are late." And you are in a restricted area. This is a demonstration of advanced combat theory, not a petting zoo for fragile curiosities. Jake offered a small, polite smile. My apologies, Warlord. My transport got stuck in a traffic vortex over Sector Gamma. And my invitation said, all diplomatic staff, welcome. I'm Jake. I handle cultural exchange. I figured a demonstration of advanced combat theory is about as cultural as it gets for some folks. His voice was calm, level, and carried a strange, lilting cadence that the universal translator struggled to properly convey. It was utterly devoid of the fear or deference one would expect. Analyst Ziv's drone floated closer to Jake, its sensors whirring. Subject designated Jake, she intoned. Human male. Life signs are nominal. Stress levels are inexplicably low. His circulatory pump is operating at a resting state. This is an anomalous reading for a prey species in the presence of multiple apex predators. Jake chuckled, a soft, airy sound. You mean my heart rate? Yeah, it's pretty chill. You should see it when I'm trying to assemble IKEA furniture. Now that's a stress test. The reference was lost on everyone. The translators simply flagged the word IKEA as an untranslatable proper noun, likely a human deity of immense frustration. Korlag Thar, however, was not interested in cultural nuances. He was interested in making a point. The human's casual demeanor was an affront to the sanctity of the ossuary. You speak of culture, human, the warlord growled, activating a plasma-forged blade in his upper right hand. The weapon hummed to life, a blade of contained sunlight that cast dancing shadows across the hall. My culture is one of strength, of martial purity. We have evolved beyond the crude implements of our ancestors. We do not swing sharpened rocks at one another. We wield the very energies of the cosmos. He gestured grandly with the blade, which left a searing trail in the air. Your species, I have read, once fought with sharpened lengths of metal. How quaint. How pathetically primitive. A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled aliens. The idea was laughable. Swinging a solid object. It was inefficient, required immense physical exertion, and was useless against modern defenses. It was the logic of a child throwing a tantrum. You know, Jake said, shifting the cloth-wrapped object on his shoulder, I wouldn't be so quick to dismiss the old ways. There's a certain elegance to them. This was too much for Korlag. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of this soft, fleshy creature was staggering. He decided, in that moment, that a lesson was required. A demonstration that would be recorded and sent to every corner of the Concordance. A final, definitive statement on the place of humanity in the galactic order. A challenge, then, the warlord declared, his voice dropping to a dangerous hush. You human, you with your quaint philosophies. I will stand here, with the finest shield ever conceived, and you will attempt to mark it, to leave a single scratch upon its surface. Use any weapon your primitive culture has ever devised. He deactivated his plasma blade and spread his forearms wide in a gesture of absolute confidence. I invite you. Show us the elegance of your sharpened metal. The hall fell silent. This was not a challenge. It was a public execution of an idea. It was a master artist inviting a toddler to improve upon his masterpiece with a crayon. Analyst Ziv's drone emitted a series of soft clicks. Warlord, the probability of the human succeeding is statistically zero. The force required to mar the shield's composite underlay would exceed the structural integrity of any solid-state ferrous alloy. The weapon would shatter upon impact. Precisely, analyst, Korlag rumbled, a cruel approximation of a smile forming on his mandibles. That is the point. All eyes turned to Jake. They expected fear. They expected him to stammer, to make excuses, to shrink away from the impossible task. Instead, he just nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on his face. Okay, he said, as if agreeing to pass the salt at a dinner table. Sure, I'll give it a shot. But can I use my own? The ones in the armory here are a bit flashy for my taste. He slid the long object from his shoulder. With deliberate, almost reverent movements, he began to unwrap the thick canvas cloth. The aliens watched, their amusement tinged with a new, unfamiliar sensation, curiosity. What pathetic relic would he produce? A ceremonial spear? A sharpened bone? What he revealed was a sword. But it was unlike anything they had ever seen depicted in their historical archives of primitive warfare. It wasn't ornate. It wasn't studded with jewels or glowing with some mystical energy. It was a long sword, simple and brutally functional. The blade was straight and double-edged, tapering to a wicked point. The crossguard was a simple bar of steel, the grip wrapped in dark brown leather, and the pommel was a heavy, unadorned counterweight. To the aliens, it looked crude, a piece of sharpened industrial scrap. It was utterly, profoundly unremarkable. A wave of laughter, a cacophony of clicks, chitters, and subsonic rumbles filled the ossuary. Korlag Thar let out a sound like an avalanche. That is your people's mightiest weapon? A sharpened metal stick? By the twin sons of Crovash, your species is even more pathetic than the archives suggested. Jake didn't seem to notice the mockery. He held the sword in his hands, testing its weight, his expression focused. She's not much to look at, he admitted, his voice soft. But she's got it where it counts. German longsword, late 15th century style. High carbon spring steel. Differentially hardened. A beautiful piece of work, really. Analyst Ziv's drone floated closer, extending a sensor probe. Scanning the object, she reported. Composition is primarily iron, with trace amounts of carbon and manganese. Molecular structure is crystalline, but unremarkable. Its hardness is rated at 58 on the Rockwell C scale. For comparison, the Warlord's shield emitter has a rating of over 9,000. The object poses no threat. There you have it, Korlag boomed. The voice of science has declared your toy to be inert. But please, proceed. Entertain us. Jake walked to the center of the arena, the polished obsidian floor reflecting his simple form. He placed the tip of the sword on the floor and began a series of simple stretches, leaning into the blade. He rolled his neck, his shoulders. The movements were fluid, economical, and deeply unsettling to the observers. They were used to pre-combat rituals, threat displays, psychic power-ups, the activation of glowing armor plates. This human was just stretching, like he was getting ready for a light jog. Subject is engaging in a series of muscle and tendon extensions, Ziv's voice narrated, a hint of confusion in her synthesized tones. My database suggests this is a preparatory ritual for physical exertion. However, his biosigns are still inconsistent with a pre-combat state. Heart rate has elevated slightly, but respiration remains slow and controlled. Adrenaline levels are baseline. This is illogical. It is the physiological response of a being preparing for a familiar, non-threatening activity. Just getting the rust out, Jake muttered to himself, though the sensitive audio pickups in the arena caught the phrase. Been a while since I've had a proper session. This should be a lot easier than a HEMA tournament back home, at least. No one's trying to hit me back. HEMA, another untranslatable term. Ziv's internal processors flagged it for later analysis, filing it alongside IKEA and root beer in a growing file of human absurdities. Korlag Thar was growing impatient. The human's calm was starting to grate on his warrior's sensibilities. It felt like a mockery. Enough of your pointless wiggling, human, he roared. Strike the shield. Prove the folly of your ancestors. Jake finished his stretch and took a moment to settle into a relaxed stance. He held the sword in a two-handed grip, the blade angled slightly downwards, the point aimed directly at the warlord's center mass. It was not an aggressive pose. It was a waiting pose, a patient pose, and for the first time, a sliver of doubt, so small and insignificant he almost missed it, entered Korlag's mind. Why wasn't the human afraid? He dismissed the thought as an absurdity. He was Warlord Korlag Thar. This was a soft-skinned primate with a metal stick. He braced himself, raising the Xylosian shield. The violet energy field hummed, a visible promise of invincibility. Strike, he commanded. Jake moved, and the universe seemed to shift on its axis. He didn't charge. He didn't swing wildly. He took a single, gliding step forward, a movement of such liquid grace that it seemed to defy the very concept of friction. The sword was not an extension of his arms. It was an extension of his will. It flowed through the air, not with brute force, but with a terrifying, geometric precision. He didn't aim for the center of the shield. His first move was a feint, a whisper of steel that drew the warlord's eye. Then, faster than Korlag's 12 eyes could track, Jake changed the angle of his blade. He wasn't trying to smash through the shield. He was listening to it. The tip of his sword made contact with the energy field with a soft hiss, and he let it skate across the surface, his movements economical and controlled. "What is he doing?" one of the Lemnians in the crowd whispered, its light form flickering with confusion. "His attack vector is inefficient," Ziv noted, her processors working furiously. "He is not maximizing kinetic energy transfer. He is applying minimal pressure, distributed over a wide surface area. This is the opposite of effective assault protocol." Korlag felt a flicker of annoyance. The human was toying with him. The light taps and scrapes of the steel on his energy shield were like the buzzing of an insignificant insect. He stood his ground, a monument of impatience, waiting for the inevitable, pathetic clang of the sword shattering. But it didn't shatter. Jake continued his strange dance. He moved around the warlord, his footwork a complex pattern of advances, retreats, and lateral steps. He used the flat of his blade to tap a rhythmic pattern against the shield. Tap, tap, tappity tap. It was a distracting, maddening little tune. It was a psychological attack, something so alien to Krovash combat philosophy that Korlag didn't even recognize it as an attack at all. He just knew that it was irritating. "Cease this foolishness and strike," he roared, taking a step forward. And that was the mistake he made. He moved. He broke his perfect stance. In that infinitesimal moment of imbalance, Jake acted. His patient probing, his rhythmic tapping, it hadn't been random. He had been mapping the shield, feeling for the subtle fluctuations in the energy field, searching for the precise location of the physical emitters beneath the shimmering curtain of force. He had been finding the seams. In a motion that was too fast to be a blur and too precise to be an accident, Jake's entire body coiled and unwound. He brought the sword around in a complex maneuver the aliens had no name for. It was a wind, a bind, a cut, all in one fluid, impossible motion. The pommel of the sword, the heavy counterweight at the end of the hilt, became a pivot point. He wasn't swinging with his arms. He was rotating his entire body, channeling the force from his feet, through his hips, up his core, and along his arms, concentrating it all into the final 3 inches of his blade. The tip of the long sword did not slam into the shield. It touched it. It touched it with the deliberate, focused pressure of a surgeon's scalpel. He wasn't trying to break down the door. He was picking the lock. He applied a precise amount of torsional force directly over one of the shield's primary emitter nodes, the very point he had located with his earlier probing. The Xylosian shield was designed to disperse massive, high-energy impacts. A plasma bolt, a railgun slug. It would take that energy and spread it across its entire surface in a nanosecond. But it was not designed for this. It was not designed for a low-energy, high-pressure, focused physical attack that twisted and ground against its core components. The energy field flickered violently, momentarily warping as its internal logic tried to process the alien nature of the assault. For a split second, the violet curtain of energy thinned just over the emitter. And in that split second, the hardened steel point of Jake's sword, backed by the perfectly applied mechanics of his entire body, bit into the composite material beneath. There was no loud crash, no explosion, just a sound, a high, piercing screech of protesting metal, a sound that cut through the stunned silence of the grand ossuary like a scream. Jake didn't stop. With the point of his sword now anchored, he began to move. He carved. With steady, deliberate strokes, he used the immense leverage of the long sword to drag its tip across the face of the warlord's shield. He was writing. First, a vertical line, followed by a curve. A J. Then, a sharp, angular shape. An a K, an E. When he was finished, he disengaged with a sharp twist, stepping back into his relaxed, waiting stance. The sword in his hand was pristine. Not a nick, not a scratch. It hummed softly with vibration, but it was unharmed. On the face of Warlord Korlag Kthar's indestructible shield, now visible as the energy field sputtered and died, was a name, carved deep into the neutronium-laced alloy. Jake. The silence in the grand ossuary was no longer just silence. It was a vacuum. It was the absolute absence of sound, of thought, of comprehension. Every being in the hall, from the lowest maintenance drone to the warlord himself, stared at the desecrated shield. They stared at the crudely elegant letters. They stared at the human. And they stared at the sharpened metal stick that had done the impossible. Korlag Kthar slowly lowered his arm, his gaze fixed on the name etched into his pride. His mind, a finely honed weapon of strategy and tactics, was a complete and utter blank. He had no file for this. No precedent. It was like watching a fish climb a tree and then solve a calculus equation. How? The word was a choked whisper, a puff of air from the mighty warlord's vocalizer. It was the single most vulnerable sound he had ever made in his life. Ziv's drone was bobbing erratically, its internal lights flashing in a frantic, panicked rhythm. Data is contradictory. Her synthesized voice stammered, the perfect chimes now discordant and sharp. The weapon's material strength is insufficient. The force applied was minimal. The shield's integrity was absolute. This outcome is not possible. It violates 16 axioms of known physics and material science. Jake casually rested the sword's pommel on the floor, leaning on it as if it were a walking stick. He looked completely relaxed, as if he had just finished a particularly satisfying crossword puzzle. "Oh, it's possible," he said, his voice echoing in the profound stillness. "You're just looking at the problem all wrong." He took a deep breath, and then he began to speak. And every word he said chiseled away at the very foundation of their understanding of the universe. "You see this?" he said, holding up the longsword. "You call it a sharpened metal stick. A primitive tool. You're not wrong, but you're not right, either. This isn't just a weapon. It's a key. It's a crowbar. It's a complex machine of leverage and geometry. My species spent thousands of years perfecting this. Not to fight giant space monsters or deflect plasma bolts. We perfected it to kill each other." A shiver, a collective frisson of horror, went through the audience. "We didn't have your natural armor," Jake continued, his voice taking on the patient tone of a museum curator explaining an exhibit. "We didn't have your claws or your acid spit. We had soft skin and clever hands. So we had to get really good at understanding things. Things like metallurgy. This isn't just iron. It's steel. High-carbon steel. We learned how to fold it, quench it, temper it. How to align its crystalline structure to create an edge that's hard enough to cut through lesser metals, and a core that's flexible enough not to shatter. We did this in mud huts with charcoal fires. We didn't have analytical drones. We had generations of failure and observation." He gestured to the defaced shield. "Your shield is amazing. Truly. It's designed to stop things that hit it hard and fast. Big, dumb, high-energy impacts. My sword doesn't work that way. A longsword isn't a club. It's a scalpel. The entire art form is about not using brute force. It's about finding the path of least resistance. It's about using your opponent's strength and structure against them." He took a step closer to the horrified warlord. "I wasn't trying to break your shield. I was trying to understand it. Those little taps? I was feeling for the vibrations. Every object has a resonant frequency. You find it, you can introduce stress into the structure with minimal effort. I was also feeling for the emitters, the strongest, most rigid points in the physical shield. The points where the energy field is anchored." Ziv's drone stopped its frantic bobbing. A single, low hum emanated from it. She was processing. "Your mistake," Jake said, pointing the sword's tip at Korlak, "was thinking that strength is about how much force you can project. For my species, strength has always been about how efficiently you can apply it. I didn't overpower your shield. I found an exploit. I used precise, torsional pressure on a load-bearing point. It's a principle from what we call engineering. You want to collapse a building, you don't blow up the whole thing. You take out the support columns. I took out your support column." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment. Then he smiled, a gesture that now seemed predatory and terrifying to the assembled aliens. "And that's just the hardware. We haven't even talked about the software." He tapped his own temple. "You're all warriors. You're predators. You're used to prey that runs, that panics. Your combat doctrines are built around it. But you've never fought a persistence hunter before." "Persistence hunter?" Ziv's voice was barely a whisper. "Yeah," Jake said. "Back on Earth, before we even figured out how to sharpen sticks, that's how we hunted. We couldn't outrun our prey. We couldn't overpower it. So we just outlasted it. We would just walk after it. For hours. For days. In the blistering heat. We'd just keep coming, at a steady, relentless pace, until the prey, faster and stronger than us in every way, collapsed from sheer exhaustion. We weaponized stubbornness. We turned patience into a killing tool." He looked around the hall, his gaze sweeping over the various species. "My comm wasn't an anomaly. It's a weapon. My low heart rate. It's a strategic advantage. While you're burning energy on threat displays and adrenaline dumps, I'm conserving it. I'm waiting. I'm watching. I'm learning. And I will keep coming long after you've exhausted yourself. He then delivered the final, devastating blow to their collective worldview. You look at me and you see a fragile, weak creature. And you're right. I am. But you're making a fundamental error of scale. You're comparing me to you. You should be comparing me to my home. Earth, he said, the name sounding both mundane and mythical. You classify it as a Class 7 garden world. That's a clerical error. It should be classified as a Class 12 death world. At minimum, our planet's gravity is nearly 3 times the galactic standard for habitable worlds. Every step I take here feels like I'm walking on a cloud. Every object I lift feels like it's made of foam. The bones you call brittle are dense enough to withstand pressures that would turn most of you to paste. The muscles you can't see are conditioned by a lifetime of fighting a force you consider extreme. We have creatures on our planet, what we would call mid-tier predators, that could dismantle this entire hall and everyone in it. A grizzly bear, a great white shark. We have insects whose venom can dissolve nerve tissue. We have plants that are poisonous to the touch. Our atmosphere is a toxic soup of nitrogen and oxygen. That's a violently corrosive gas, by the way, that we have to breathe every second just to stay alive. Everything on our world is in a constant, brutal, unending war with everything else. And we're the ones who won. He let that sink in. The grand ossuary, the cathedral of violence, was now a schoolroom, and the students were failing the final exam. You think we're weak because we're not covered in armor? Jake asked, his voice now laced with a chilling intensity. Our weakness is our greatest strength. It forced us to be smarter. It forced us to cooperate. You see a room full of individuals. I see a pack, a tribe, a species that learned that the only way to survive in a world trying to kill you every second is to work together. Our empathy, our social structures, our ability to form bonds, those are the most dangerous weapons we have. You just haven't seen them deployed yet. He finished his impromptu lecture, the silence stretching on for an eternity. He then wiped the blade of his sword clean on a piece of his cloth wrapping, a simple, practical gesture that was somehow more intimidating than any threat display. Korlag Kthar finally moved. He let his arm drop. The shield, with the name Jake carved into it, clattered to the obsidian floor. The sound was like a thunderclap, a final, definitive punctuation mark on everything the human had said. He looked at the human, and for the first time, he did not see a fragile mammal. He saw a monster wrapped in the skin of a diplomat, wielding a philosophy of violence so ancient and so refined it made his own millennia-old traditions look like a child's tantrum. He saw a persistence hunter, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his very core, that he was the prey. What kind of a species? The warlord finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. Spends millennia perfecting such an art, just to kill itself. Jake shrugged, the gesture a universe of casual dismissal. It's what you do when you don't have Saturday morning cartoons, he said, wrapping his sword once more. He slung it over his shoulder. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm late for a diplomatic luncheon. They're serving something called a quiche, hope it's not too spicy. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing softly in the cavernous hall. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He left behind a room full of the galaxy's most elite warriors, strategists, and intellects, all of them staring in abject terror at the spot where he had stood. They were reevaluating everything they thought they knew about life, about strength, about the small, soft-skinned species from the insignificant little star system in the galactic boondocks. Analyst Ziv's drone floated down to the discarded shield, its sensors scanning the deep grooves of the human's name. Her internal processors were running at 1,000% capacity, trying to build new models, new paradigms, to account for the impossible data she had just witnessed. Her synthesized voice, now quiet and filled with a new, terrifying awe, spoke the only logical conclusion. Recalculate, she whispered into the silence. Recalculate everything.